You're listening to The Truth About Bible Study taught by Pastor Dan Christians at Maple City Baptist Church in Chatham, Ontario. For more information about Maple City, please visit us online at maplecitybaptistchurch.com.
So this morning is going to be a little bit different of a class than usual. What I would like to do this morning is I'd like to present you with a situation that's going on in the world today, discuss some of the facts that we know about that situation, and some of the responses of different countries. And then I want to kind of open this up for discussion, and I have a few questions prepared here that we'll discuss. I have a few verses that I think we should talk about that relate to the subject. But I'm hoping that you're all ready to have just a vital, an important discussion, vigorous, filled with vitality. You could probably get a lot more V's. If we really want to. Vivacious, is that? Yes. It could be all of those things, really. I mean, this is one of those topics. What I want to talk about right now is the greatest humanitarian crisis that some say that the world has ever seen. And this is the situation with the refugees that are coming out of Syria and other places around the Middle East right now. I thought it was important for us to discuss it because right now there are about 60 million refugees in the world today. 60 million people displaced from their homes. There's never before been so many people at one time displaced from their homes. In Syria alone, there are 23 million people in the country. Of the 23 million people that live in Syria, half of them have been displaced. So 4.5 million people have fled Syria, no longer in Syria at all, in neighboring countries and around the world. And 6.5 million people are still in Syria, but they're displaced. They cannot be in their homes or their city or their village anymore. And so they're living in tents kind of oftentimes just outside the city limits. There's many people who are aware that there's a situation going on there, but I think not a lot of people that have taken the time to get into what are the statistics? What's actually going on? What's the reason for it? What's the cause? And so what I want to do this morning is I want to be able to explain to you what the response has been from different places. I want to look at the situation and what caused it in the first place and why it's happening right now and what kind of state they're in at the moment. And then I want to open it up for discussion because I want to talk about the Christian's role in this and what we should be thinking about it and what if anything we should be doing about it or what positions we should be taking. And I think that in a class like this one I've seen controversial things come up before and we were able to have non-violent discussions about them. And so I'd like to see that this morning. I think that we can have, and I'm sure there will be some differing opinions in this room, and I'm hoping that we can discuss those in a Christ-like way and hopefully learn from each other. So let's pray and then we'll get into the lesson. Father, we thank you for this day. Lord, I thank you for your love for us, and I thank you that we know you're in control, that you're sovereign. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us this morning as we think about this problem, that it doesn't affect us directly, Father, but it's affecting so many people around the world. And Lord, help us to think biblically about this subject. Help us to have your mind. Help us to think like Christ would. And Lord, I pray that you'd just bring light to this discussion this morning instead of heat. We thank you, God, for loving us, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want to begin this morning just discussing a little bit about the response of the world. You have 60 million refugees around the world, many of them recently coming from Syria. What has the response been? Well, I think, first of all, if we're going to talk about Canada, it's important to know that Canada generally takes in about 24,000 immigrants that are seeking asylum every year. So that's about an average of 24,000 every year. That's been the average for about the last 10 years or so. And that's not all of immigration. That's just immigrants seeking asylum. So ones that are not going through the normal channels, the normal process, those that are just kind of placed on our doorstep and we have to figure out what to do with them when they get here. From 2004 to 2013, there were 600 Syrian immigrants. Only 600. Compared to 17,000 from Colombia, for example. And so there are many other countries where a lot more immigrants had been coming from prior to just recently. Since then, since November of 2015, there's been 40,000 Syrian immigrants enter into Canada. And so over the past 14 months or so, there's been about 40,000 Syrian immigrants entering into Canada. We have pledged to take an additional 25,000 Syrian refugees in 2016. We made that goal. We actually got to 26,000 in 2016. And in 2017, the goal is 55,800. So more than double last year. The goal of Canada is to take in over 55,000 Syrian refugees. Many of these are taken in through government grants. Most of them are. But a lot of them are still through private donors who are offering to pay for the refugees coming in, offering to pay their expenses when they're here. And so it's not all government, but most of it is. If we are speaking about immigration of all kinds, just to kind of put the number of 55,000 into perspective, the average immigration in Canada per year is 250,000 per year. And the fact is, Canada as a country, the population would be declining if it wasn't for immigration. Immigration is an important thing. Okay, right now we're reproducing. Canadians are reproducing themselves at a rate of 1.6. You need at least 2.1 for the population to be stable. And so immigration keeps us afloat, I guess, or keeps our population increasing in a small way. We'll compare this to the USA, in the United States. In 2016, the USA relocated 85,000 refugees. And so that's obviously a bigger number than Canada. We're at 25,000, but the USA is about 10 times more populated than Canada. And so it's less in terms of per capita. They planned to take in about 100,000 refugees, and that's been reduced to about 50,000 by Trump. And so they've already taken in 36,000 in January. So essentially, the USA is looking at taking 14,000 more refugees in over the course of the rest of the year. Of those refugees, and this is a lot easier to do from the States' perspective than it is in Canada, because Canada doesn't provide as much information about religion and that type of thing when they come in. So in the U.S., you can have access to that information, and 61% of the refugees that were taken in last year identified as Christians. 22% identified as Muslims. I think that's just a statistic that's not very well known. I think most people assume that immigrants that are coming in are all coming from the Middle East and they're all Muslim. And the fact is, 61% are identifying as Christians, and a lot of them are coming to flee persecution. So of the 36,000 that have been taken in already in January, 14,000 were Christians fleeing persecution. That was their reason for coming in. To compare this to other places in the world, Turkey, who borders, the largest border on Syria, has 2.7 million refugees. Just kind of, a lot of them are just living in camps along the border. Lebanon has 1.1 million. Jordan has 0.7 million. Germany took in 158,000. Sweden took in 50,000. And a lot of other countries are very low. The United Kingdom was like 2,000, so very low. That was as of 2015, 2016. They upped that amount. I'm not sure what to, but... So, of those who have entered into the U.S. as refugees, none have ever killed an American in a terrorist attack. So there certainly have been Muslims that have killed Americans in terrorist attacks. We know that's very true. Many of us remember exactly what happened on September 11th, and we remember exactly where we were when we heard the news that the towers were going down. But just so you know, most of the terrorist attacks that have ever happened have occurred because people were given business or education visas, not because they came over as refugees. The vetting process, or the process that usually goes through, is about 18 months long. So it's a fairly long process. That's not to say that it shouldn't be, there aren't ways to make it better, but it is to say that in some cases it's hard to make it better, simply because when you have people that show up that have no documentation, that were forced from their homes, that you can't go to their government and say, give me their documentation, they really have nothing. And so you're just, ultimately, you put them through whatever process you can, but there's no good history, reliable history to go on in their lives. So, why is this happening? Why is there this state in the world, and specifically, why is this happening in Syria? Well, it all started back in 2011, just 6 years ago. The Syrians began to demand more rights and more freedoms in their government. They actually wanted more of a democracy democratic type of government rather than it was an autocratic type of government. So there's just one authoritarian man in charge. And so they wanted more of a democracy. So it started actually as teenagers writing graffiti on walls. And these teenagers were arrested. And after they were arrested, a lot of adult protesters came out against that arrest. And the adult protesters, some of them were shot at and killed by the authorities. And that caused more protesters, and got to up to 100,000 protesters in a march. And that was kind of the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And so now you have a really interesting situation because it begins with rebels in the country who are rebelling against their authoritarian government, saying they want more of a democracy. So you have two sides. But Hezbollah has stepped in, and they're kind of backing Assad. So Assad is the ruler there. And so Hezbollah is now a part of the fight, and they're taking sides with Assad. And then ISIS, or the Islamic State, has seen this as a great opportunity for them. And so they've just kind of joined the fight as, we don't want him in charge, we don't want you in charge, we want to make this an Islamic State. And so you have regions that are controlled by the Assad regime, you have regions that are controlled by Hezbollah, you have regions in Syria that are under rebel control, you have regions that are under Islamic State control, under Kurdish control, the Kurds got involved, and you have some regions that have a great deal of Russian presence. So you have this country, and if you looked at a map of this country and you put colors on who controls what area, it would just be this collage of colors. Circles here, lines here. It's an incredible thing to imagine a country that's being controlled by so many different groups of people that there really isn't any person in charge. The fighting hasn't been very nice. Okay, it hasn't been kind of more traditional warfare where you might allow some of the civilians to leave. What generally happens is one of these groups determines that they're going to take over a town or a city or a place. And so they go in, guns raised, and they do whatever they need to do to destroy everything there so that they can take control of that area. And certainly you have people fighting back, but a lot of times it's people fighting like from their homes, trying to defend their homes. And clearly a lot of people are ultimately forced to leave the city, to try and get over a border, to try and just find some way to get out of where they are. A UN Commission of Inquiry has evidence that all parties to the conflict have committed war crimes, including murder, torture, rape, and enforced disappearances. They have also been accused of using civilian suffering, such as blocking access to food, water, and health services through sieges, as a method of war. The Islamic State has also been accused by the UN of waging a war campaign of terror. It has inflicted severe punishments on those who transgress or refuse to accept its rules, including hundreds of public executions and amputations. Its fighters have also carried out mass killings of rival armed groups, members of the security forces, and religious minorities, and beheaded hostages, including several Westerners. So you have this state now where if you look at the news, if you see some pictures, there are just cities after cities after cities that are reduced to rubble. There's nothing left. The cities are mostly built out of cement, and it's just crumbled everywhere. Families are racing against time. They're rushing towards safety. They're doing everything they can to get safe. And then you have just sickening images where a child washes up on a beach because he was trying to flee and fell off the boat. And like those types of things where you have boats that are just packed with 4 times more people than they're supposed to be able to hold. And you have people who are in charge of these boats that are expecting crazy, crazy amounts of money from each person to pass because they know that's their only option. I mean, you just have the sinfulness of humanity on full display in every possible way in this place. And you have people suffering losing everything because of it. So that's the situation that's going on right now. There's nothing been resolved. There's been many different attempts to have discussions, but what generally happens is they show up in a room together, they speak very briefly, and then they leave, and the talks fall apart. There's been no substantial peace talks that have actually come to anything so far. So the political process, it hasn't worked thus far. And so there are a number of ideas of what should be done. One question is, I mean, at some point, should other countries be stepping in and ending the war through force and then trying to create a government? Well, I mean, some people think that that's what should happen, but so far that hasn't worked anywhere else in the world. It just doesn't seem to work when you take over and then you eventually try and slowly hand back the reins to someone. Usually the reins end up in the wrong hands. And so some people think that that's what should be done. Some people think, well, no, it's really not a good idea to accept too many refugees into our own countries, but why can't we just try and create refuge cities within Syria? And so go in there with force and take over an area and say, this is a refugee city where if you're a refugee, you can come. Now that sounds reasonable. That doesn't sound like a terrible idea to me. But you do have some problems still with that. I mean, you've just created one place where everybody can attack. You've also created one place where, I mean, you're talking about refugees, you're talking about people with no documentation, with nothing to support who they are, and there's no reason that a terrorist couldn't just slip in there either and wreak havoc in those places. So it's really hard to set up a place like that, and it will require a great deal of manpower from a lot of countries to do something like that. So there's a huge cost to it as well, and there's a cost of life as well. Others say, if every country steps up, every country in the world were to step up and do their part, then handling this many refugees it's not an impossible task. So, what I want to discuss today, and I want the rest of this class to be you discussing and your input and your ideas. I have some questions lined up here. I have some verses that we can talk about to keep the discussion going. But I want to know, as a believer, what is your initial reaction to all this information? I mean, how do you respond? And as a believer, how do we respond?
I respond. What it involves Israel. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is as a Christian, Israel means a lot to us, and I think the Muslims they hate the Jews,
mm-hmm.
and so we have an enemy against Israel,
mm-hmm.
and biblically, Israel's going to be the Lord's going to be using them again
mm-hmm.
in the future. That's
mm-hmm.
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a consideration in how I think is thinking about Israel first.
Okay.
And I believe that a country doesn't exist unless there's borders.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if anybody comes into a country, they ought to be patriotic to that country. And if their beliefs
mm-hmm.
aren't patriotic to this country, then the vetting should be,
mm-hmm.
I'd say,
mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's space for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not going to be part or patriotic of the country you're coming into.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would cause more problems.
Okay.
On the other hand, I think when you see women and children being abused and starving to death, there's a humanitarian responsibility that we have. And
mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly how to
Yep.
come up with a solution for that other than aid and
Yeah.
something like that. So.
Yeah. Okay, so Ms. Rainey, you covered a lot of different points
I'm
there.
sorry.
No, that's good. It's good. But there's a lot worth discussing. I think in Syria, you're right, a lot of, some of the refugees that exist in the world are caused by the conflict with Israel directly. And at least from what I've seen here with Syria specifically, Israel isn't the main factor. It's more of a civil war that's going on within Syria. So a lot of the refugees we're talking about here, they're from, Syria is a Muslim country primarily, and so most of the people are leaving are Muslims, and most people fighting on both sides are Muslim, just of different types of Muslim, or just backing a different leader, a different ruler, a different ideology. And so in this case, I don't think it's easy enough for us to just say, well, we should just back Israel, because it's not really a major player.
I mean, to
mm-hmm.
consider them in the equation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in the Middle East, that certainly should be a consideration. But I think here, if we just focus on Syria, it's not a huge factor. Okay, so that was one point you made. You made a lot of points.
Sorry.
No, but bring them up again as we go, okay?
I heard a fellow talking to another person, and he said there are Islamic State in the middle of all these refugees getting free access into countries. My heart goes out to people who are suffering. I think it's a terrible thing. I put myself in that position, and what if you had children and you didn't have any food? It's awful. And then I see places like England when a whole lot of a group of people go in and they create their own laws and they have no-go zones and terrible things happen in those. So I think like Greg, if they would come and submit to our laws and not try to change it, I think it's a wonderful thing to help people. But to have people come in and change your country into what didn't work there is hard for countries who want to help, and it's not easy to know what that solution is, because no one wants to see somebody suffer.
Right.
There's a lot of innocent people, but you have to be really careful how you help, don't you? They do need help, but how you help is... my cousin was a missionary in a Muslim country, and he said it's a whole different thing when they're not a minority, but once they get the majority, things change quickly.
Yeah.
So, they get a chance to get the gospel here. There's a lot of things that, and God's behind this. Nothing happens that God does not allow. So we have to really be before Him to know what to do, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of that tension that you brought up between we should be helping people and we should want to help people, but we also have to be wise and be safe. I think that's a really real tension. So I guess the discussion that we want to have today is just, I guess as Christians, what is our responsibility, and then how do we separate between what actually isn't our responsibility, not just for what we should and shouldn't do for Syrians as a whole when it comes to policy, but what are decisions that are above our pay grade? Because I think sometimes we should separate between how a Christian treats a Syrian refugee or a Muslim person here in Canada from what we think that policy ought to be. Those are two separate things. A lot of times we blur those lines. So, good. Kim?
I just read a really good article by Franklin Graham. He was talking about in the biblical times how there had to be walls around cities and how the government had to protect the city. And I just think, but then he works with Samaritan Purse also, and he says that when they're helping, they'll help people from ISIS and anything as far as, if they had, I don't know, a wound, a leg blown off or something, they help. But they were saying to see humanity, what it is, but then government has to protect its people. And I thought that was a really good way to look at it.
I'll read a few verses I think kind of attached to those different points. So first, Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to 6. Let every soul be subject to higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resists the power resists the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Wherefore, you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay tribute also, for they are God's ministers attending continually upon this very thing. Okay, so in this text, I think we get some idea of why God ordained the government. And the clearest thing that we see from that view is that it's the government's job to resist evil, to stop evil when possible. And that if you do evil, then you will be in their way and you should be afraid of that. And if you do good, you'll have praise of the same. So we understand clearly that this doesn't always happen. And part of the problem in Syria is that wasn't happening. So this is kind of a general idea of why does government exist? Well, government exists primarily to stop people from doing evil. So the government can't change people's hearts. It can't make people good. It can't do any of those things. But a government can enforce rules, and they don't bear the sword in vain. So there is a reason for government, and part of the government's job, I would say, is protection of their people. Okay, that is the resisting of evil. So part of the discussion has to be, what does the government need to do to ensure that we're resisting evil? we're protecting evil. But I'll bring up that statistic again. Thus far as the refugees that have come to the United States are concerned, there has not been one refugee that committed a terrorist attack. There's been a few that have been arrested for potentially being involved in terrorism, but none that have committed any type of terrorist attack that has resulted in a death to this point of refugees that have come in. There's been people on visas and that type of thing. So we do want to say, yeah, the government needs to do this, but we also want to be wise and say, let's just not decide blanketly that, well, that means we can't have any refugees. Maybe they're not the problem. Maybe there are other areas that we need to be more careful about. Sam?
But isn't the ultimate success as a Muslim, or a Muslim is not the ultimate success to destroy? Like if you are welcoming people into your country, that to be the most successful in their religion, they achieve violent acts.
Yeah. Okay. So I think to put that in perspective, would we say that the ultimate success for a Christian, maybe not ultimate, but a successful thing in a Christian nation would be for our nation to see everyone converted to Christ and to be following Christ's commands and to be following what the Bible teaches? Would we say that that would be a successful thing among Christians? Right? We would. Be very nice. Okay? And we would love to see that happen. I don't expect it to happen, but we'd love to see it happen. So for a Muslim, they believe the same thing. They think that if everybody were to follow their God and their religion and their truth, then the world would be a better place. And now there are some people, and they've done statistics on this, and I can't tell you exactly what they are off the top of my head, but there are some people, and I think it's around in the 10% range that believe that should be done by force, whatever means necessary, that Islam should conquer. There are other people that don't believe that they would be a part of force, but they're not really against the force. They're just kind of, and that's a large group. And then there are other people that say, no, that's completely wrong. They shouldn't do that. Islam is a peaceful religion, and so it should be accomplishing what it's to accomplish with peace. And I think that of the Muslims that I've met, of the Muslims that live in Canada and live in Chatham, they would be definitely more of this moderate type of Muslim. They don't believe in anything other than peace, and generally they're pretty moral people. Like we're not talking about the worst of the worst in Canada are probably, as far as morals are concerned, is not going to be your moderate Muslim, right?
Protect, though, if other Muslims came in, would they protect us?
Some would, some wouldn't, right? Some fight in the armed forces for us, so some would, some wouldn't. And knowing exactly who would and who wouldn't when it came down to it is hard. I don't know if we can know that.
Yeah, just along, you start running with statistics and numbers, it's really confusing. And just along this line with Sam's question, it was asked among Muslim people, Muslim nations, and this is maybe what you were referring to, about how they feel about Sharia law. And over 70% believe that Sharia law should be the law of the world. And I think that's probably the concern for most believers and most Westerners when we realize it's a religion that seeks to undo Western culture. And I think that's a scary part for a lot of people. Because Sharia law is not what anyone in the Western Hemisphere wants.
No, that's right.
It's oppressive and violent and terrible. So I think in the conversation, we have statistics, and statistics can be manipulated too, but I mean, that is a concern I think a lot of people deal with. So for whatever it's worth, there it is.
No, you're right, and I think that I think that all of these things need to be weighed when we're thinking about this. So Beth, go ahead and then.
There was a lady from a university in the States that decided to do she was traveling in the Middle East, and she decided to do a survey among Muslim wives to see what their lives were like. And so she decided to interview people from extremist homes and those from moderate homes and those that were just, mildly Muslim. And every single, I don't know how many hundred women she interviewed, but it was a large survey. In every single case, when she asked the women, have you ever been beaten by your husband? Every single one said yes. So that is a concern.
Absolutely. I said Carolyn next. Carolyn.
The Quran and the Bible are totally different.
Yeah.
And in the Quran, there's a place that says, I have a higher standing in heaven if you shed blood and kill a person. So it depends how strong a Muslim they are and what they're following. Extremists is what we're seeing on the news. But if they follow the Quran like it says, they think it's an honor to kill someone. So I think it just depends. how extreme or how closely they follow that Quran, because it is not a peaceful religion. There's some good people in it, but the writing in the Quran is not peaceful.
No, Carolyn, you're right. There are a lot of verses in the Quran that speak about beating your wife into submission, and that speak about killing the infidel. One of the things that maybe just might be helpful is understanding how most Muslims view the Quran. So they recognize that within the Quran there are verses that contradict one another. So there are other verses in the Quran that you could read and you could compare them to Bible verses and say, yes, see, it says we're supposed to love our neighbor, we're supposed to do good to them, we're supposed to be kind, we're supposed to be peaceful people, we're supposed to do all the things that as Christians we say you ought to do. And then you read a verse later on and it says, well, you should kill the infidel, and you go, that I don't understand how these things work. And what Muslims understand is that there are different verses that take precedence at different times. And so some verses, some teachings are to be followed during this time, maybe during wartime or during this period when the circumstances are this way, and others are to be followed when the circumstances are this way. And so a peaceful Muslim can fully go to the Quran and justify their peacefulness. And they wouldn't say that they're just less excited about the Quran. As a Christian, we would say that the Christians that really take the Bible seriously are the ones that actually will live and serve and die for their faith, and because they love Christ. And I feel like when you're a Christian and you go deeper and deeper into taking the Bible truly and literally and trying to follow it, you actually become more and more like Christ, which is a positive thing. I guess what I would say is I'm not sure the opposite is true, that if a Muslim isn't more Muslim because they kill people, they wouldn't see it that way. They would see it as the Muslims that kill people are following these set of verses because they believe this is what's appropriate now, and the Muslims that are being peaceful are following these set of verses because they believe these are appropriate now. But they wouldn't consider themselves less Muslim or less serious about their faith, just that they think that this is the rule for this time. Does that make sense? I hope, like...
Dangerous teaching, that's all.
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
Quran is dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. And every other religion is dangerous to some extent. I mean, anything that's man-made is dangerous ultimately, but even like Hinduism that preaches peace, there's a lot of people killed in Hindu countries, right? You take countries that have no religion, and you see a lot of Christians being killed in those countries because they have no. So no matter where you are, you're in a dangerous spot. But you're right, something to be aware of. Tom was next, and then
I worked with a moderate Muslim in a factory, and they were nice people, and they wanted their children to marry Canadians and everything like that. We would have a Christmas party. They would drink wine, so they're very moderate. Okay, after I left the factory, I heard later that this nice Muslim guy made sexual advances to one of the co-workers there, a female, and he ended up being fired. The problem is the religion that they have. Like, they do not treat their women.
No, you're absolutely right.
Another thing, too, is there is a situation here in the city of Chatham. CCI was sold to a Muslim people. It is a Muslim school. And I've talked to police officers, and they said they will not let anybody in that school. They won't let the fire department in, they won't let the police department in, and those kids are learning the Quran. So the question is are they assimilating into the culture, or what are they up to? And we're not allowed.
Yep.
They can come into my house and check my fire alarms.
Right.
They can't go into that school.
That is very strange. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Okay, Ken was next.
I was just going to say they had the Bible at first, they threw it out. Now look at the land they got. And they were the first to have the Bible. And now look at the problems they got by throwing it out.
Yep.
Same thing's going to happen to us. Only they're going to take over. They're going to take over Canada. I might not live long enough to see it, but I think you're going to see the Muslims taking over because our Canadian government is allowing them to have freedom. Everybody wants freedom. Everybody wants freedom. Well, they're going to get freedom someday, I believe.
Yeah, that could happen. Yeah.
You know, in the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
our God told his people, when they went into these pagan countries,
Mm-hmm.
to destroy those, so that his people would not learn their evil ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at Canada bringing these people into our country who are brought up to be violent and all this other stuff. And what's going to happen is our children are going to be infiltrated by these people's thinking. And if they were rebels in their own country, they're not going to come here and be peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, in essence, we're asking for trouble.
Yeah, I think they're not rebels in their own country. They're fleeing. They're fleeing war in their own country. So they're not.
You said part of the fighting started because.
Yeah, so there are rebels that are fighting there. There are
Right.
people that are forced out of their homes because they're not taking a side. They're just civilians running away, right? So they're not fighting. They're trying to get out of the fight. It's
When
not.
they come here, they believe that what they have is the truth, right?
Yeah.
So they're naturally going to buck up against the Christians because they don't want what we have. They
Mm-hmm.
want peace. They want freedom.
Mm-hmm.
They want food and shelter and all of that, which is good,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But when they want to force their beliefs, and if the Christians get outnumbered,
Yeah. Then we're no longer in control.
exactly.
And it's gonna happen too.
Okay. Michelle?
Probably really naive, and Travis doesn't want me to talk, but
I wish you were Muslim.
but I do realize that there are like people like the government out there that need to make the tough decisions and the tough calls. But I think like as an average Christian just living here in Chatham or whatever, I think our responsibility and our role is to love our neighbors and to feed the needy and to help the poor. And like I'm not going to be making any big government decisions tomorrow, but I can find out where refugees are coming in and help and love the people that have come into the country. So I think like sometimes people get so worked up about the big decisions, and I think like we should just be obedient in our call to love.
So it's separating the role of government and the role of the Christian.
And that's the big problem right now. And I think that believers don't understand the role of government and the role of the believer. Because and when you bring those two together, you always have trouble.
Yep.
You always have trouble.
Good.
I just wish we could bring in more Christian people from Syria. There's so many Christians that are persecuted terribly there, and I'm great. It's wonderful to have the Muslims, but let's get the Christians in here too.
And on the other hand, we need to be sharing the gospel with
Yes.
these people. We
Yes.
should not shrink away with fear. Like, you know, you're friends with them, you talk to them, you're neighborly, you love them, but you tell them about your Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Muslims getting saved.
Yeah.
I've heard there's an incredible amount of Muslims coming to Jesus.
And you know, part of it is that they're hearing the truth for the first time.
They are.
Yeah, and that they've been in countries that have been closed to the gospel for so long that. I mean, I feel like there's a different way of looking at this, and I don't want to get too far into it today because I'll have nothing to say next week. But I am looking. I hope you come back next week because I've got a lot more to say. Sam?
Oh, I guess I'm just wondering, because I do totally agree. We have to just obey in our little, like, do our thing, do what is right in our little community. But we have issues like abortion, and when we say that we have a responsibility to fight the government because we know it's wrong. So at what point do we actually have to fight what's going on in our government because we know that what they're choosing to do is really wrong, or do we just always
Yeah.
do what's right in front of us?
So at what point is the duty of the Christian to stand against the government?
When it goes against God,
The government goes against God.
that's why. Innocent lives. Dan, why do we fear the Muslims?
Why do we fear them?
There's a fear, there's a concern, you know. I mean, we kind of group them all together. I think one of the problem is after 9/11 and some terrorist attacks, there was no spokesman for the Muslims to stand up and say, hey, we denounce what has been done. There was silence, and there was celebration in countries that celebrated the deaths of 3,000 people on 9/11, that they cheered and that. And that's what we saw. And I think that's where we're basing this overview of the Muslims on, is from past experience. And there's a fear. And I don't know if it's legit or, you know, we need to use common sense and certainly biblical principles in dealing with the Muslims.
I think that is it is legitimate that there aren't probably enough Muslims that stand up to denounce those things publicly. I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and I think that that this whole past year has been just shone a spotlight on this, that the news media is able to tell any story in the most exciting and interesting way possible. And they manipulate us constantly, and we have no idea that it's happening. And so, like, when I see something on the news, what is the most exciting story that happens after the attacks on the Twin Towers? What is the
heroic effort to save lives?
Okay, heroic effort to save lives. So we saw some of those stories being covered. Yeah. And then how about the and there's these thousands of people that are celebrating in the streets because all these people are killed. That's just, it's fear mongering. It's, you know, let's draw attention to and I don't know, maybe it was like full countries that are celebrating this, or maybe it's just small groups of Islamic State terrorists that are celebrating. There are small groups, there are many of them. So it's really hard to just, like, I think sometimes you ask the question, why do we fear Muslims? And I think every single one of us has a picture of what we think a Muslim is built into our head. And depending on who you've read and what you've watched and what you've been exposed to and who you've been exposed to, you have a slightly different version of what it means to be a Muslim. I think that ultimately, like, there's one guy that wanted to kill me because I said that we shouldn't kill Muslims. Some of you are here for that. So, I think, aside from all of those views, there is more direction that the Bible brings to the issue than maybe we've discussed thus far. So hopefully next week we'll get a chance to go into all those things.
Why would the Muslims stand up or speak out against it if there's such duplicity in the Quran?
Well, that's a good question.
Probably why they announce it.
I think there are many.
As for the Quran, it can go either way.
Yeah. There are, I think, a lot of Muslims that if you were to speak to them, they would be against it. I think that a Muslim speaking against it, and there are groups, just so we're clear, there are groups that are against it, groups of Muslims that are against it. So it's not like a complete blanket, no Muslims are, not all Muslims support terrorism. But part of the reason is I think that this is such like almost a race thing that's tied to Islam for them, and that they feel speaking against their people. Yes, I don't think that I do that, and if you ask me privately, I would tell you that, but I'm not going to stand up against my nation or against, I think that's some of it. It's not a good enough excuse, but it's a reason.
The ones that are bringing attention to it would be the ones that would be following the, shall we say, the darker version of the philosophy.
Yep. Right. And again, what's a more interesting statement? To have somebody on the news that's got a video that's talking about how they're going to behead someone because they're American or whatever, or is it more interesting to have some people that say, no, I don't think that's a good idea? So it's more exciting when somebody's getting beheaded, right? So that's what they're going to put on the news. That's
CNN News. That's probably one of the most hyped up news I ever watched.
Yep.
If I watch it.
Oh, I think that I really don't have a lot of respect for any news channels at the moment. So I can't.
It's negative news.
Yeah, it is. So, anyways, thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for the discussion. You guys did great. Your participation was fantastic. And next week, I'm looking really forward to talking more about this.